If you're ready to harness the power of your communications data, blast off with Nylas today.
Happy Friday, Ram.
Happy Friday, Ash.
So I guess today we don't want to waste any time because there's just a lot of really cool stuff to get to. We're going to be talking about webhooks and fun things that we can do, setting up Nylas Webhooks and building on a tool called Pipedream. There's just a lot of really fun stuff to dig into. So why don't you start us off by just telling us, what are we going to make?
Yeah, so from a high level, we're going to work through setting up webhooks. And just to talk about webhooks a bit, I know we've gone through webhooks in past videos. Think of it as a more reactive approach to software development. So you're always receiving information coming in, and you can decide what to do with that information. You can either decide to act on it, or you can decide just to kind of leave it or just ignore it for the time being. So it's a better approach to kind of getting information. So it's very event driven. A good analogy would be getting a push notification. So you get a push notification on your phone. You can decide, oh, do I want to read this message, or I can just kind of wait for it or ignore it for the time being.
Yeah, I kind of like to, my simple sort of way of saying it is like, it's the don't call us, we'll call you.
Yeah.
Method. And the word call is so apt, right? Because like what you could do instead is, if you wanted to know about changes, kind of take an approach that we call polling, right? Where you're just, hey, Nylas, anything new? Hey, Nylas, anything new? Hey, Nylas, anything new? You can do that, I guess. It's not ideal. Most of us would say that polling is something we all want to avoid. And so instead, this gives you the ability, like having webhooks gives you the ability to open up your own API endpoint and then say, hey, Nylas, this is the endpoint. When you got something new, tell me.
Yeah. So taking that concept, we're going to build out and test out webhooks, Nylas webhooks, using Pipedream. And we'll take a look at Pipedream in a second. So we're going to spend time in two different areas. We're going to use the Nylas dashboard. And I like to think of the Nylas dashboard as a really solid developer tool when you're building with Nylas. So you can do things like create webhooks, look at different logs, and as well modify webhooks as well. And as well, we're going to use Pipedream. And in Pipedream, you can actually build out different flows for a specific endpoint. And with that, we're going to look at how you actually set up a webhook. We're going to take a few steps there to do that. And as well, how you can actually receive events in Pipedream for a specific webhook. So all that information will be sent to Pipedream from Nylas. So let me just jump in and share my screen, and then we'll take a look at Pipedream first before we dive into any code or kind of coding up the actual webhook. So I'm just going to share my screen. And we're going to first take a look at Pipedream -Explore. So you can definitely take a look here if you get a chance. You can go to Pipedream as well, pipedream.com/explore. And what Pipedream allows you to do is it allows you to build out an individual endpoint that you can actually trigger by a webhook. So we're going to actually use the flow of setting up an HTTP webhook. And on top of that, we're going to add some additional code so we can actually respond to the webhook. And this will be needed when you actually need to create a Nylas webhook. So we'll take a look at that in a second. So again, there we go. So again, think of Pipedream as a way to kind of build out APIs, specific endpoints and triggers that you want to create a workflow from. So we're going to look at creating an actual node workflow. And what this does is anytime our endpoint is going to be triggered, which we'll set up, we'll be able to run JavaScript in Pipedream. So you can think of this as setting up a serverless function on Pipedream for you to test out and build webhooks with Nylas.
Really cool. So in other words, we get to literally write a function like what we're seeing here in Node.js and have it sit on Pipedream. And then Pipedream is going to give us some sort of endpoint, right? So at some point in this process, I'm sure we'll see like a URL endpoint that then you'll be able to register with Nylas to say, hey, Nylas, when you got information, call this endpoint. In doing so, we'll trigger this function.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and just kind of start writing this out, and I'll talk through what we're going to build out. So when we press run node code, this will take us to a workflow. So the workflow has two different parts. And the first one we need to set up is an actual trigger. And the trigger is going to be any one of these triggers. So there is an ecosystem of APIs that you can use to trigger events. And the one we're going to look at is setting up an HTTP webhook request. So what that means is we'd be able to take this information and pass it on to Nylas as our own endpoint that we want to be able to work within. So here, this trigger can receive HTTP request. It can receive all the data. And for the HTTP response, what we're going to do here is we're going to set up a custom response. And this custom response is what we're going to write out using JavaScript in a node environment. So we're going to select return a custom response. And then we're going to go to the next step, which is actually writing out the code. So here, once we press save and continue, we're going to actually get an endpoint that we can pass on to Nylas. So this is going to be the endpoint that we can use when we're building our webhooks. And before we actually set this up in Nylas, we're going to do one more thing. We're just going to write out the actual code that we need so that we can actually respond to a webhook initialization from Nylas. And before we actually write out the code, one thing that we need to keep in mind when building with Nylas is anytime we want to create a new webhook, Nylas actually expects that webhook to be active. So if the webhook is active, it's going to send a challenge parameter. Once it sends a challenge parameter, it's going to expect that information to be sent back. So let's go through a code, writing out some code here, and then we can talk more about that. And if you're curious, you can always look at the code samples available to you in terms of what things that you can actually build out when creating a Pipedream workflow. And in our case, we're going to look at sending an HTTP response. And in this HTTP response, we're going to return the actual challenge parameter that Nylas sends to us.
So when we get this this sort of shell of a function to get started with on Pipedream, it looks like as part of the run function that they defined there, we're getting a couple of parameters within. Are we going to end up using any of that? Is there stuff there that we should talk about?
Yeah, so the one thing to keep in mind is that the information, we can access the number sign, which is going to give us access to different functionality. And we're going to use the number sign dot respond to be able to send a response back to the Nylas server. And as well, the steps will contain any information from the previous steps. So for example, if we want to access any query parameter, we will use the steps variable to access that. So let's jump into the code, and I can walk you through what we're going to build out here. So here we're going to actually first focus on a GET request from Nylas. And this GET request is to initialize a webhook. And first thing we're going to do is we're just going to check. We're going to do a conditional statement, and we're going to take the information from the query parameter. So we have to kind of walk through the steps, and we're going to take the trigger. So this is anything passed into the trigger, and we're going to grab a query challenge. So the query parameters are available on the query object, and we're just grabbing the challenge parameter that's passed to us from Nylas. And here what we're going to do is we're going to respond. So we're going to use the actual number sign function. So we're going to do await number sign respond. And inside here, we're going to pass a status of 200. And we also need to return the query parameter. And the reason that we need to do this is so that Nylas will say, hey, I just want to double check that this endpoint works. So I'm going to send a code to you. I'm going to send a challenge parameter to you. And I expect that information to be sent back.
And so here what we need to respond with is basically defined by what Nylas expects. So in that response there, you've got that object again with status and body. But yeah, if you're watching this and curious about, okay, why these specific sort of responses, it's because that's what Nylas expects. So you would be able to find, of course, if you were just building this from scratch, you'd be able to find that in our documentation. But basically it's provide a status and then provide that challenge that you received right back to Nylas.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and deploy this, and then we can kind of take a look at what this looks like in action. So we're going to go ahead and deploy this functionality. And it's going to take us back to the console or the overview for that actual endpoint. So for now, we have the trigger. So we're going to need to copy this endpoint. And as well, we do have some code here that's going to respond to the initial request from Nylas. So what we can do with this is we can take this information over to the Nylas dashboard, and we're going to create a webhook using the Nylas dashboard. So we're going to press create a webhook, and the webhook that we're going to create is going to be the message updated webhook. And we need to pass in an actual callback URL. So this is the trigger that we created in Pipedream. And as soon as we press create webhook, what Nylas is going to do is actually going to make a GET request to this URL, to this callback URL with a challenge parameter. And it's going to expect that information to be sent back so Nylas can activate or initiate the actual webhook. So now we see that the webhook is actually active. And if we go over to Pipedream, we'll see that we got a GET request. And in this GET request, we got a challenge parameter. So this is the information that we needed to send back to Nylas so that we can actually activate or initialize the webhook. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to continue building the actual JavaScript code. And here what we're going to do is we're actually going to build the step where we actually need to respond to any future or incoming webhooks. So far, we've only written out the code to actually initialize a Nylas webhook.
Yeah, and I guess it's a good point to double down on here, that it's a single endpoint that we're deploying, and it has this if else or logic in here to say, okay, if this is a challenge, here's what we need to do. But otherwise, we're actually getting some signal back from Nylas, and we want to be able to handle that in some way. So that's the part that we're getting to now, but it's just worth kind of bearing in mind that all of this is being handled from a single endpoint.
Yeah. And inside here, for now, I'm just going to write a console log just so we can see what information is being passed to us. And again, we're using the steps variable, and we're going to get the information that's passed into the trigger. So the trigger would actually be the first step here. And the trigger, we're just going to console log what's returned from Nylas, or what's sent to Nylas on each webhook event. And another thing to keep in mind here is we actually need to respond to Nylas. The reason that we need to respond to Nylas is because Nylas wants to ensure that each webhook event is successfully received. And to do that, we actually need to send back a status 200. So this ensures that we do not get any retries from Nylas. So we need to respond with status 200 to ensure no retries. And this is important so you only receive the event once and not multiple times. So now we're going to go ahead and deploy this code. And this is the functionality that we need so that we can start receiving webhook events from Nylas for any one of the webhooks that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. So now what we've done is we've created the actual post code. So anytime a webhook event is sent, we'll be able to console log it out and as well respond with a status of 200. So what we need to do for that to happen is we actually need to update one of our emails. And just to recall, the webhook that we created was a message updated webhook. So I'm just going to the Nylas dashboard, and we have a message updated webhook here. So as soon as we go ahead and update any one of our messages, so for now I'm just favoriting a message and unfavoriting a message, we should start seeing this information pop up in the actual Pipedream dashboard. So you see here I favorited a few messages, and if we click on them, we can go to the trigger and we can see what information's passed in. So the information that's passed in is telling us that a message updated event occurred, and it tells us the ID of the message that was updated.
Really cool. So this is also something that when getting started with webhooks, sometimes developers are going to have questions about, right? Which is, okay, is this enough information for me to do something with? But the reality is that a webhook is there to give you just the right amount of information to then be able to act upon that according to what you want to do without sort of over providing stuff that you may not even need up front. So based on, just based on the webhook that the message was updated and this is the message that was updated. And from there, depending on what your integration wants to do, you can go take action on that by using the message ID, for example, to go grab the latest details or who knows what else you might have in mind.
Yeah, so this is a great way when you're building webhooks in general, working with Nylas to test them out and build out a quick flow without having to kind of deploy your own server and go through all of the DevOps steps necessarily, especially when you're doing or kind of doing that initial integration step.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great tool, lots of fun. I actually had a lot of fun just watching you code in this environment, and getting something up and running so fast is with the webhook is a huge win. One other thing to keep in mind with webhooks too, which is I think quite interesting in the context of Pipedream, is that a lot of times we may be tempted to say, okay, here's my application server, and I want to support webhooks. I want to be able to receive information from an integration, and we're going to put that on the server as well. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that webhooks actually tend to send a lot of information quite frequently. And so that may not be ideal depending on your system architecture, to have a single endpoint that's taking on that amount of request. And so having a different place to set up your webhook endpoints like Pipedream, for example, is really cool, because then you can kind of handle the fire hose, if you will, of stuff coming inbound, and then have your logic there to figure out what you're going to do with that, and then maybe pass just the right amount of information along to your application server.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Building out a backend off the bat, it's nice to kind of break it down into steps and think about it as you go along. Also, I just wanted to share, just to wrap up here, feel free to check out any of our videos. Go to youtube.com/c/Nylas. And we'd love if you can subscribe, and you can kind of continue to follow along on us sharing the developer journey and building with Nylas.
Yeah, we do a couple of these a week from the Nylas DevRel team, and we just cover all sorts of topics and tools, and we love taking on requests as well. So if you got anything you want, feel free to reach out through however you can reach out. So sometimes that comes in the form of YouTube comments. It could come as Twitter DMs or just mentions or whatever else. But feel free to reach out to us. We love getting a request, because we'll figure out some great stuff to help you achieve what you're trying to achieve with Nylas.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ash.
Ram, thanks for another fun topic on a Friday. I really enjoyed this one. Love watching you code some Node.js in Pipedream and handling Nylas webhooks. I hope people give it a try. I'm sure they'll have a blast.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you.